Let us pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Tony Campolo, in his book, Let Me Tell You a Story, Life Lessons from Unexpected Places and Unlikely People, recalls the time when a young professor of English literature at a state university walked into his academic dean's office and announced that he would not be back on Monday to teach because he was quitting. Now, the dean explained that there was no way he could just walk out of his contract, right? If he quit, he would have no future in teaching. He would be blackballed for any job for which he applied at any other school, regardless of the level. And to all of this, the young professor simply shrugged his shoulders and said, "That's okay." Well, his mother called Tony and told him what happened. And she asked Tony to please and go and talk to her son, to reason with her boy. And after all, he had a PhD in English literature. What else could he do with his life except teach, right? So Tony agreed to see the young man. He was living in an attic apartment in Trenton, New Jersey. Tony says it was one of those with-it lofts, that was decorated with interesting posters and had bookcases full of avant-garde books. "I quit," he told Tony. "That's all there is to it. I couldn't stand it anymore. Every time I walked into that classroom, I died a little bit inside." Tony writes, "I understood what he was talking about because I myself was a college teacher at that time. I knew what it's like to walk into a classroom and pour your heart out for truth wrenched from suffering and pain, gleaned from the sorrow of human existence. And after you cry and bleed for truth, some student in the last row raises a hand and asks, 'Do we have to know this for the final?' And a college professor dies a little bit inside," he said. After a while, Tony realized that there was no dissuading this young man from changing his mind. "So, what are you doing now to make a living?" Tony asked him. "Oh, I'm a mailman," he said. "Wait, a mailman with a PhD? Now, that's interesting." "Yeah," he said, "there really aren't too many of us out there." "Well," said Tony, trying to muster up his, Protestant work ethic, "if you're gonna be a mailman, then be the best mailman that you can ever be." "Oh, I'm a horrible mailman," he said. "Everybody else in my post office gets their mail delivered by 2 p.m. in the afternoon, or 3 at the latest. I never get it delivered before 5 p.m., and that's on a good day." "Well, what takes you so long?" Tony inquired. "Oh, I visit. You can't imagine how many people on my route never got visited until I became their mailman. There are interesting people on my route who are interested in literature. There are hurting people who need the comfort that comes from the great poets. There's people who read and just want to share what they've learned with someone. I can't even sleep at night." "Why, because you're so excited about your job?" "No, because I've had 20 cups of coffee that day visiting with everyone." Tony said he wasn't surprised the following year when people on his mail route got together and threw him a surprise birthday party at the local American Legion Hall. He was special to them. They were special to him. His mail route had become what Tony says a mission field. It filled him with joy, and it filled their lives as well. What a wonderful way to find fulfillment in life. So welcome to the fourth and final installment of our current sermon series, Praying Human, the Psalms. The series has been a short introduction to a wonderful book in the Old Testament known as the Book of Psalms. And the 23rd Psalm kind of gets all the PR around Christendom, but there are 149 other Psalms in the Book of Psalms that have a wide range of human emotions and human conditions expressed within. And I've only really been able to scratch the surface of the Psalms in these 4 weeks as we're going through this series. I hope, though, it's given you a little bit of encouragement to open up the book, the Bible that is, and turn to the book of Psalms and spend some time reading. In fact, if you're interested in doing a deep dive into the Psalms, my mother-in-law Joanne has put together a reading plan just on the Psalms that will get you through all 150 Psalms in 1 month. There's even a 28-day, 30-day, and 31-day guide, depending on how many days in the month. And don't worry if that's too much to read at one time. Just start reading through it, and you will be blessed with the time you spend. If you're here in the church today, in the lobby, you can take one of these home with you. If you're worshiping with us online, call the church, and we'll either email or mail this to you. Each week during this series, we've been focusing on a different human emotion, delving into how that emotion impacts us as humans, but then also exploring whatever our psalm counterpart is for the day and seeing how that psalm expresses the particular emotion we're going through. And we tie it all together as being God's children. So we've looked at fear, anger, loneliness, and we wrap things up with joy. Now, I'd like to start by briefly talking about the difference between joy and happiness. Happiness is often related to moments of pleasure, success, or achievement. It's usually tied to external events or circumstances. It's more emotion-based, and it can fluctuate depending on the situation, like receiving good news or enjoying a favorite activity, say going to Disneyland or achieving a goal. So happiness is typically more fleeting than joy. Joy, on the other hand, is generally considered a deeper and more consistent state that's often connected to internal fulfillment, purpose, and spiritual well-being. It can be expressed or experienced even in difficult and painful circumstances. It's often tied to a sense of meaning, gratitude, connection to something or someone larger than yourself. Many see joy as an enduring state of being that's connected to contentment and satisfaction in life overall. Now, we often look for those moments of happiness, and rightly so. But a deeper prayer might be that we experience true joy in our lives. Enter Psalm 126. It's another short psalm. It only has 6 verses, but it mentions joy or laughter 5 times in those short 6 verses. And yet, you might just be surprised how it goes about talking about joy. It's a psalm about joy remembered and joy anticipated. Let us turn together to Psalm 126, verse 1. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Klaus Westermann, in his commentary, The Living Psalms, notes that this opening phrase of restoring literally means to restore the restoration. He says that means to bring about a change. And this opening line is recalling the devastating event in Israel's history, the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in 587 BCE by the Babylonians, which led to the Jewish exile. The writer of this psalm, that I will frequently refer to as the psalmist, says, "When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion," meaning when the Israelites who were in captivity were finally able to come back home to Israel and start over again. When that happened, the psalmist says, we were like those who dream, meaning the change was so unexpected, so overwhelming, so incredible, it could hardly be comprehended. The exiles had spent 7 decades, almost 70 years in captivity. It must have felt to many of them like they would never get back home. And yet, God, in his goodness, provides a means to restore the fortunes of Zion and bring them home. Surprise, surprise, what a blessing it was for those exiles. So, the psalm starts in Israel's past, looking back to what God has already done. And even in the midst of one of the most painful and destructive chapters in Israel's history, it starts there and then remembers how God brought them out of that. as it moves forward. Biblical scholar Arthur Weiser summarizes this psalm in his Old Testament library commentary by writing, "It proves equally true of pure childlike delight in the hope for joy and blessing, of awe and wondering praise of the majesty and grace of God, of the intimacy and assurance with which the psalmist prays, and also of the powerful comfort which that hope imparts on the way through darkness to light." So that's where we're heading in this psalm about joy, from darkness into light. Verse 2. "Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them." The Lord has done great things for us, and we rejoiced. So here's our first encounter with the word joy in this psalm. It comes after the exile, after the people have experienced 7 decades of being rejected and isolated and been in despair in a foreign land. Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. The pain and the struggle in our lives often seem so long, maybe not 70 years long, but seems long for us. But then, says the psalmist, then, in time, joy and laughter will come. The people of faith are remembering the past of what God has done in their lives, or what God has done in the lives of their ancestors, the ones that came before, their parents, their grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, whoever it may be. And they comment about this, that it was such a powerful movement by God that other nations started commenting on it. Other nations said, wow, the Lord has done great things for them. Sometimes others notice what happens in our lives, and they connect it to our faith, and they begin to witness to the fact that God has done amazing things in our life, and they're introduced to the glory and power of God. And sometimes God can use whatever it is we're going through, the ups and the downs, the challenges and the struggles, and when we make it through those things by the grace of God, it impacts others. Maybe for some of us, while we're going through it, we haven't even come out of that yet. It makes an impact on others. And they say, whether out loud or in their hearts, wow, the Lord has done great things for them. But then it's up to us to also voice that goodness. It's not enough to simply experience God's grace and restoration in our lives. We need to testify to what God has done. We need to say, yes, the Lord has done great things for us. And rejoice. When's the last time you gave thanks for what God has brought you through? Maybe not recently brought you through, but over the course of your life, when is the last time you looked back at that and gave thanks? If it's been a while, I invite you to do that today. I read a sentence last week while I was preparing for this message. It was from Arthur Weiser in his commentary, and he wrote, "Joy in God casts its light on the future, and such an assurance of faith conquers grief." Joy in God casts its light on the future, and such an assurance of faith conquers grief. You see, when we take the time to look back at our past and to acknowledge what God has done in us and through us, that joy casts its light on our future, about what is yet to come. Because what is yet to come is verse 4. And this is where things take a turn. "Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the watercourses in the Negev." Now, it would be easy if you're just flipping through this because you're moving on to the next thing on your day to miss the power of what's happening in this verse. To say, "Restore our fortunes, O Lord," means that the psalmist is in the midst of another big struggle or challenge. Or as the ancients used to say, a dark night of the soul. Something has happened in their life that their fortunes have taken a turn, and they are pleading for God to make a change. Biblical scholar James May comments that this is a Hebrew idiom that's very difficult to translate into English. but it's rooted in the prophetic sayings of the Old Testament, where it's used to mark a radical change from conditions brought about by divine wrath, or what people assumed and perceived to be God's punishment in their lives, and turning it into divine favor. Restore our fortunes. Take us from those places where we feel like God is punishing us, or we feel cut off, isolated, and abandoned by God, into a situation where we are remembered and seen and valued and loved and blessed by God. It's a deep cry for restoration and healing. It's a cry for change. Like water courses in the Negev. That's a phrase that would have resonated to the people in the ancient Near East. You see, the Negev is the southern desert region in Israel. In fact, its name, Negev, or Negeb, literally means south or dry land. And it was characterized by, everyone knew it as a very harsh environment to live. And yet, there were times in the year when streams would run. Now, we also live in a desert region, maybe not as harsh as the Negev, but we know how spring often brings wildflowers and green landscapes and even water in our riverbeds from time to time. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the watercourses in the Negev. We don't have wildflowers and green landscapes and water in our riverbeds all year long, but when we do, we notice it, and it is a blessing, isn't it? Verse 5. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. John Goldingay, in his book, Psalms for Everyone, remarks about what it's like for those that live in a farming or agrarian society. He says, each autumn and winter you might feel some anxiety as you went out of your village to plow the fields and to sow your seed. You might weep as you did so. You never really know whether there would be enough rain at the right times during the coming months to generate a crop. Arthur Weiser notes that it was a very common ancient idea that any farmers that go out to sow also have this time of mourning. In ancient Egypt, sowing was often accompanied by singing funeral hymns as a symbol of the burial of the god Osiris. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, then it bears much fruit. You see, a powerful mystery takes place when seeds die, when they're planted, maybe not 6 feet under, but they're planted in the ground, buried, if you will. And over time, with the right conditions, they can sprout forth into amazing new life. So the psalmist is in the midst of some kind of unknown trouble or distress or catastrophe in his or her life, and by looking to Israel's past, by reflecting on what God has done, is hopeful for what God still can do again. And the psalmist finishes with this verse and these words. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. This is where the psalm becomes a psalm of trust, right? In the midst of upheaval and uncertainty, the psalmist looks to the past in order to frame a foundation of trust for God in his or her future. Those who go out weeping shall come home with shouts of joy. What a powerful declaration. It hasn't happened yet. The psalmist is still in the midst of struggle, but he or she is testifying to the belief that God will restore their fortunes. God will turn things around, and that is why this writer can be filled with joy even in the midst of crisis in their life. Romans 8:28 reminds us, we know all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to God's purpose. I didn't really start listening to contemporary Christian music until the 1980s. Artists like Amy Grant, David Meese, Phil Keaggy, Larnell Harris, Sandy Patty, they were all sort of my introductions into this genre. And then in 1988, an artist named Stephen Curtis Chapman burst on the scene with this album that I bought on my brand new CD player that I got in college called Heaven in the Real World. Sorry, Real Life Conversations was his album. Heaven in the Real World was his first song from that. But I was hooked. And I kept listening to SC Squared, as he's affectionately called by his fans, as he made album after album, and his music never ceased to touch my heart. As Stephen and his wife, Mary Beth, started having their family, they were able to give birth to 3 children, and then they ended up adopting 3 other children from China, the youngest of which was Maria, whom they brought home in 2004. This little one just grabbed my heart, Stephen said of her. Maria bonded quickly with her sister, Stevie Joy, who was only 7 months older, and the two became like twins. They went to the same preschool classes, they dressed alike, they played together all the time. And then their older sister, Shoei, short for Shohana, loved and watched over them both, as did their older American-born siblings, Emily Caleb and Will Franklin. Maria often woke up smiling and singing, and videos from that time, one more adorable than the next, show her laughing and playing, jumping from bed to bed. Maria quickly established herself as, the Chapmans, our most spirited child. She was the one you'd put in bed and say, don't get out of bed. And about 20 minutes later, you're doing every discipline measure you know to try to get her back into bed. When Maria was happy, all was right in the world. She was so funny and goofy and silly. And when she was unhappy, her mother said, the world was coming to an end. And the world knew it. There was no middle ground. On May 21st, 2008, Maria and her 2 sisters were playing in their yard. Maria was trying to reach up for the monkey bars, but she wasn't tall enough, and Shoei wasn't able to lift her sister that high, and that's when the girls heard their big brother Will pulling into the driveway with his truck. And Shoei told her younger sister that, I know Will is strong enough, and he will be able to lift you up there. Maria took off running toward the SUV as Will made the turn in, and he never saw her. Their mother inside the house heard the commotion. She got to the motionless body first. Stephen, who was on the porch on his cell phone, he arrived seconds later. He started performing CPR, calling for help. Maria was taken by helicopter, but she did not survive at Vanderbilt Hospital. We didn't know how we were going to take our next breath, Stephen said. I'd go where nobody could hear me, and I would scream until my voice was gone. It didn't, and it still doesn't make sense. But I never felt like God abandoned us, he said. As news of this tragedy spread throughout the Christian music world, Mary Beth Chaplin could hardly believe all the people that were reaching out in love and concern. She said, so many people loved on us, and it was wonderful, but we just wanted Maria back. It's a completely unfixable, broken beyond repair situation until heaven. In heaven and only in heaven, this might start to make sense. Stephen Curtis Chapman explained that he has found courage to continue to trust God and to know that God is working all things for good because of the Psalms. And he spent a lot more time reading the Psalms since Maria's passing. He said, for me, the Psalms have become so precious and powerful. When you hear the psalmist saying, Lord, how long are you going to forget me? Forever? I feel hopeless. I feel desperate. But then the psalmist goes on, even so, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to hold on to your goodness and your faithfulness. I'm going to declare it, and I'm going to sing it. I'm going to live with both the already and the not yet. And I think that's something that I've just felt like God has encouraged me to encourage others with, he said. A year after the tragedy, Stephen Curtis Chapman released this album, Beauty Will Rise. As you might imagine, the entire album was dedicated to his daughter Maria and the aftermath of her passing and all the ups and downs that came along in that journey. It's a powerful collection of songs. In fact, if you have access to a streaming service or even you want to go to YouTube and look it up, take the half an hour it might take to go through the songs, you will be blessed. The final song on the album is called Spring is Coming. And I want you to listen to some of the lyrics and tell me if you don't hear Psalm 126. We planted the seed while the tears of our grief soaked the ground. The sky lost its sun. The world lost its green to lifeless brown. Now the chilling wind has turned the earth hard as stone. And silently, seed rises beneath ice and snow. And my heart is heavy now, but I'm not letting go of this hope I have that tells me spring is coming. Spring is coming. And all that we've been hoping and longing for will appear. Spring is coming. Spring is coming. It won't be long now. It's just about here. It's been a long and painful recovery since Maria's death in 2008, but the Chapman family continues to trust God's healing and restoration, even, or shall we say, especially after an unspeakable tragedy like what they endured. That's a picture of Psalm 126. Remember the words from Arthur Weiser earlier? Joy in God casts its light on the future, and such an assurance of faith conquers grief. That's the power that we can find in the Psalms. That's what it means to pray human. It's not easy. It's not neat or tidy. It's definitely not pretty, but it is life. So whatever it is that you're experiencing right now, I entrust Psalm 126 to your prayerful care, that it may enable, embolden, empower you to express a similar kind of expectant joy, knowing what God has done in the past, in your life, in the community of faith, and the people that you've grown up with and know and love, and trusting that God will restore your future. Because all things work together for good for those who love God. And that you can count on. Spring is coming. Thanks be to God. Amen.